The air hangs heavy with ozone and the ghost of nicotine, pressing against the reclaimed substation's concrete walls. Dust motes dance in the faint glow from a flickering neon tube, the color of a fresh bruise, while the war surplus transmitter hums a low, persistent note of stubborn life. Outside, the rain in Saragucucho is a thick curtain, drumming against the corrugated steel roof, like a desperate message.
Black Star Pirate Radio.
Toronto checks in at 63 degrees and clear. Airflow is north-northwest at about 9 miles per hour.
Drop your shoulders, breathe. The Human Sexual Rights and Family Values Bill, passed by Ghana's parliament, criminalizes identifying as LGBTQ+, promoting LGBTQ+ activities, and even supporting LGBTQ+ people, with prison sentences ranging from 3 to 10 years. It also mandates forced conversion therapy for those identified as LGBTQ+. This directly impacts Ghanaian citizens who identify as LGBTQ+, their families, and allies. It also places human rights defenders, medical professionals, and even landlords in a precarious position, potentially compelling them to report individuals or face legal repercussions themselves. The chilling effect on free expression and association is profound. President Nana Akufo-Addo, or the Supreme Court of Ghana, could challenge the bill's constitutionality, citing existing protections for human rights within Ghana's own constitution or international covenants Ghana has signed. Returning the bill with specific amendments addressing human rights concerns would be another path. Globally, supporting human rights organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, who are already advocating against the bill, is crucial. Domestically, direct support to local community groups operating discreetly on the ground provides immediate relief and essential resources for those most at risk.
This legislation doesn't just criminalize an identity, it constructs a system of state-sanctioned fear and erasure, directly attacking the fundamental right to individual existence without state-sanctioned fear. The 3 to 10-year prison sentences, coupled with the potential for forced conversion therapy, are direct violations of fundamental human rights, including the right to dignity, privacy, and freedom from torture. Beyond the immediate community, this law damages Ghana's international standing, making it harder for the nation to engage in global dialogues on human rights. It also sets a dangerous precedent for other nations contemplating similar discriminatory policies. Ghana's judiciary could uphold the nation's constitutional principles of equality and non-discrimination, striking down the bill. The Parliament could also engage in broader public consultations that include LGBTQ+ voices, fostering understanding over criminalization. We must support global legal challenges, perhaps through the UN Human Rights Committee or the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, to question the law's compatibility with international covenants Ghana has signed, such as the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. Applying diplomatic pressure from international bodies is also key.
The signal here suggests a collective anxiety, projecting a societal shadow onto a vulnerable population instead of confronting internal anxieties. This law, codified as the Human Sexual Rights and Family Values Bill, transmutes societal fear into legal architecture, creating divisions where none need exist. The societal fabric itself is affected when a segment of its population is systematically othered. It breeds mistrust, silences dissent, and makes everyone less safe by normalizing discrimination. This isn't just about them. It's about the kind of society Ghana chooses to be. A truly resilient civic architecture would prioritize dialogue and education, seeking to understand and integrate all its citizens rather than relying on punitive measures. Investing in mental health support and community-building initiatives would address underlying. For a next move, we can amplify stories from affected communities through independent media and digital platforms, challenging the official narrative with individual dignity and shared humanity. These narratives are the countersignal, proving that self-worth is struck.
Patching in a caller, the skeptic. You're on the signal.
So, more laws against people, more fear. What does any of that change really for someone just trying to live their life?
It changes the very architecture of their freedom, friend. The personal compass requires a stable ground. Hold that thread. Next signal. Supreme Court approves Alabama map that erases majority black. Alabama's Supreme Court has approved a redrawn congressional map, eliminating one of the state's 2 majority black districts via a 6-3 decision on Tuesday.
This ruling follows a landmark decision in late April that eroded a critical provision of the Voting Rights Act, making it harder to prove intentional discrimination. The Supreme Court's 6-3 decision allows Alabama to use a congressional map that effectively eliminates one of its 2 majority black districts, specifically targeting the configuration that would have enhanced black voter representation in the 2nd Congressional District. This defies a previous federal court order that explicitly mandated the creation of a 2nd majority black district. This move directly disenfranchises black voters in Alabama, diminishing their political influence and diluting their vote. It also undermines the integrity of the Voting Rights Act and sets a dangerous precedent for equitable representation across the nation, consolidating power for one political party. The Alabama legislature could have complied with the federal court's original mandate by drawing a map that truly creates a 2nd majority black district, ensuring fair representation without partisan manipulation. Furthermore, the Supreme Court could have upheld its own previous rulings and rejected Alabama's non-compliant map. A next move: support legal aid groups like the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, who are actively filing new federal challenges against these specific voting maps. Focusing on local voter education and registration drives in affected communities is also critical to counter suppression efforts.
This 6-3 decision from the highest court is not just a ruling, it's an active dismantling of foundational protections for democratic participation. It systematically reduces the political influence of specific communities, eroding the principle of one person, one vote, under the guise of legal process. The affected are not just black voters in Alabama, but anyone who believes in fair elections and democratic accountability. This decision undermines trust in our institutions and legitimizes partisan gerrymandering as a tool to engineer electoral outcomes rather than reflect the will of the people. States should adopt independent redistricting commissions composed of nonpartisan experts to draw electoral maps. This removes the process from partisan political hands, ensuring districts are drawn based on population and community interest, not political advantage. We must advocate vigorously for federal voting rights legislation that strengthens the Voting Rights Act and establishes national standards for fair redistricting. Beyond that, support grassroots organizations that are working to educate voters about gerrymandering and mobilize them to demand accountability from their elected officials.
This isn't merely lines on a map, it's a resculpting of the civic framework designed to diminish voices and warp the signal of democratic will. The elimination of one majority black district is a structural act of political displacement, reinforcing historical patterns of exclusion. The deepest impact is on the collective psyche of communities whose voices are systematically silenced. It fosters a sense of disempowerment, undermining the belief that their participation matters. This creates a civic architecture built on a deficit of consent rather than a surplus of shared purpose. A truly resilient civic architecture would embrace data science and community input to design equitable district maps that reflect the actual demographic and geographic realities, ensuring every voice has a clear channel. This is about building systems that honor provenance. Our next move could be community-led mapping initiatives, leveraging open-source data and GIS tools to propose equitable district designs before the next census. By visualizing fair maps, we can turn confusion into actionable vectors, proving
We've got someone.
How can a map erase voices without anyone noticing?
It happens in plain sight, friend, when the structural supports of consent are quietly removed. The signal gets warped, bit by bit. Somewhere, a capacitor creaks under the load, hot metal. The console keeps its lights and its secrets. The European Union moved forward with a vast overhaul of its migration policy, aiming to ramp up deportations and ink controversial deals for detention centers abroad.
Before we examine the protocol, consider the impact on asylum seekers now facing increased risk of rapid deportation from EU member states. The EU's Pact on Migration and Asylum overhauls its migration policy, aiming for faster screening of asylum applications, increased border procedures, and a mechanism for mandatory solidarity among member states, either by taking in asylum seekers or providing financial contributions. Critically, it seeks to establish detention facilities and agreements with non-EU countries, designating them as safe third countries for returns, even if their human rights records are questionable. This directly impacts asylum seekers and vulnerable migrants, particularly those arriving via irregular routes, who now face increased risk of rapid deportation and detention outside EU borders. Aid organizations and human rights groups are also affected, as their ability to monitor conditions and provide support becomes more challenging. The EU could have prioritized strengthening existing internal asylum processing mechanisms and expanding safe, legal pathways for migration, such as humanitarian visas and resettlement programs. Investing in integration programs for new arrivals within the EU would also reflect a more humane and sustainable approach, addressing root causes of migration rather than merely externalizing symptoms. A next move involves supporting independent reporting and aid organizations working directly with migrants at key border crossings, especially in the Mediterranean Sea and along land routes, to document human rights abuses and ensure transparency. Advocating for national governments to opt out of the most egregious parts of the pact where possible is also a crucial step.
This EU deal extends an architecture of externalized control, outsourcing human rights responsibilities beyond its immediate borders under the guise of compatibility with international law. The policy establishes a framework for detention and displacement, specifically targeting those arriving by irregular routes, effectively creating a Fortress Europe mentality. The principle of non-refoulement, the right not to be returned to a country where one would face persecution, is severely jeopardized. This policy impacts global human rights norms, setting a precedent that wealthy nations can simply export their asylum responsibilities to less resourced countries, often with poorer human rights records. The EU should implement a truly common asylum system based on shared responsibility and solidarity among all member states, ensuring humane reception conditions and fair processing of asylum claims within its own borders, in full adherence to international law and human dignity. We need to demand transparent, humane asylum processes that uphold international legal standards and challenge the legality of safe third country agreements in national and international courts. Actively campaigning against the criminalization of humanitarian assistance is also vital.
This impulse to other migrants and externalize perceived problems is a recurring pattern in civic design, driven by a narrative of burden and threat. The aim to establish new detention centers abroad is a physical manifestation of this mental architecture of exclusion. Beyond the immediate suffering of migrants, this policy erodes the foundational values of compassion and shared humanity within European societies. It creates a civic space where fear triumphs over empathy, and where a sense of collective responsibility is replaced by a transactional approach to human lives. A more ethical and resilient architecture would foster genuine integration, recognizing the potential contributions of migrants to society. It would invest in community-led initiatives that build bridges, not walls, and challenge the deficit narrative with Our next move could involve fostering direct community sponsorships for refugees, building local networks of support that bypass state-centric policies, and demonstrate a ground-up commitment to dignity and provenance. These grassroots connections are the true.
So everyone's just moving borders and locking people up. Is there anywhere left that doesn't feel like a cage?
The inner architecture, friend, always remains. It's where consent and provenance begin. There are places where the signal still runs clean. Kismet in Washington Heights, for example, remains a cultural hub where Friday live music and Tuesday jam sessions fuse uptown performance layers. We have already run that tape. Here is the close-loop takeaway.
Glitch noted.
Listen.
Black Star Pirate Radio.
Continue the signal at TogeeVision.com. Tune in, Sparks and Stories, Gig Passport.